Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for staying with us. You all just heard Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, present an inspirational but also really scary address here, giving the Aristotle address here at the Athens Democracy Forum on basically the state of democracy and the major threats that are posed to democracy. And I mean, in many ways, Brad doesn't really need an introduction, but let me just give a brief one for all of our viewers out there right now. Brad is, you're the longest serving executive at Microsoft. You're sort of the institutional bridge, basically, between the current leadership and Microsoft's legendary founder, Bill Gates. You, as the chief legal advisor to the company, have steered the company through the days when Microsoft itself was the big bad empire. And there were calls for you all to be broken up through its current incarnation as really the world's biggest cloud computing force. And throughout this transition, you yourself have morphed into basically the major, global ambassador for the tech industry. And Achilles, when he was introducing you, was mentioning that normally during the Aristotle address, we have heads of state speak. But in many ways, you are sort of the private sector equivalent of a head of state now in your role advising governments around the world about how to deal with these threats that you mentioned during your speech, namely how social media platforms in particular have also become, have used to be conduits for good, witness the Arab Spring, but obviously have sort of major downsides. Talk to us a little bit, just back up a little bit and tell us about how did you get into that? And at what point did you recognize that this was really such an important thing that is happening in the world that it's actually, as you described, can be used potentially as a threat to democracy?
Well, thank you, first of all. And I do always feel I should make clear, I speak for Microsoft. Obviously, every company has great people who work for them, and we all agree on many things and disagree on some things. And I'm sure they don't look at me as their representative when we disagree. But I do think the last decade has really seen a profound shift. And yeah, I think that we saw this wonderful start around the Arab Spring. I think you're right to mention that. And if you remember the headlines of that time, it was fundamentally about how technology and social media and communications technology were almost engines of democracy in a new way. And then we saw a shift. I think there was an inflection point in 2013 around the Snowden disclosures. I think people suddenly saw what government could do with technology. I think there was another inflection point 5 years later with Cambridge Analytica, as we saw ways that social media could really be used in a manner that I don't think its creators ever intended. And so, the other thing that we obviously have seen is something that, interestingly enough, 4 years ago, before the last presidential election in the United States, we were sort of almost in denial of. It was, gee, are the Russians using technology to attack the United States electoral process? And so you put these different realizations together, and they, as well as then just sort of the piling on, I would say, by other countries in some cases, other domestic groups and others, have caused us to realize we have a problem. And we're starting to talk about solutions, but I don't know that we're yet really grappling with either the specifics or perhaps even the magnitude of steps we may need to take if we're going to protect democracy adequately.
Well, one of the big questions that has certainly come up in a lot of the discussions during this conference and beyond is sort of, where do you draw the line? Obviously, you had worked, if I understand correctly, for instance, with the government of New Zealand after the massacre in Christchurch, in which 51 people were killed at 2 mosques, to basically sort of help come up with guidelines that the government could use to require the social media companies to be held accountable, but also to take down, insightful, hateful content. And we've seen a similar movement in France and in Germany. Talk about, to the extent that how successful those initiatives are, and to the extent that they're not, what else needs to be done?
Well, first of all, I think that they are interesting and important models that give us some learning and some inspiration for the future. I think fundamentally we're not dealing with one line, but ultimately perhaps multiple lines that will need to be drawn. I give huge credit to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. I mean, the way she responded to that terrorist attack in Christchurch was not only to show empathy for everyone that was impacted, which was basically an entire nation, if not the world, but to take action. And so the Christchurch call that she championed, that other governments and tech companies came together to embrace, really did create a line around something like violent extremism, the use of technology, social media in particular, to disseminate it, the dangers of live streaming. Because I think it was easy to start with the premise that what a wonderful world it would be. Every one of our 7.8 billion inhabitants gets to be a broadcaster. And we learned from Christchurch that that's not necessarily a good recipe for the world. And now you see new constraints applied across the tech sector to live streaming. But as your question really suggests, I think we need to go beyond these kinds of voluntary efforts. We do need laws. You heard Facebook earlier say we need regulation, and I think across the tech sector, you're hearing that, and for good reason. Ultimately, our shareholders may have elected our boards of directors, but the people of nations did not elect us.
But in saying, we need regulation, there are critics out there who basically say that stance is a bit of a cowardly stance, that the companies should be doing, a lot more themselves. Facebook has, in their advertisements here, talk about how they've hired 35,000 people around the world to monitor content. And yet, in a conversation I had earlier today with an Israeli minister, the country was very upset that, according to her, Facebook didn't take down content that Israel had deemed to be insightful. So where does, should really governments be that much more involved, or how much more can the companies themselves really step up here?
I personally believe it's one of these questions that people ask as if, should it be this or should it be that? And the answer is it should be both. I do believe it's right that especially the democratic governments of the world be the ones to enact laws that will create the safeguards and limits and regulations around how technology is used in, say, the electoral process. But I think that the criticism that you mentioned, I'm not trying to make a point about Facebook, but the criticism more broadly needs to be heard. And it needs to be heeded. And I think the reason is because we'll never live in a world where we can count on every government to act. It's just not that kind of world in which we live. And so I think as companies, we have a responsibility to be responsible. That's why, for example, in the area of facial recognition, we've articulated a view, and there are some that agree, and there are some that don't. But what we said is, here are the principles that we think should be embodied in law, and we're not going to wait for law to embody them for us to adopt them. We'll exercise self-restraint. And I think it is that combination that people should look to the tech sector to really focus more on addressing.
And those are very important sort of moral lines to be drawn by companies. At the same time, there are some out there who then would say, and maybe Aristotle himself might ask this question, well, in that case, should Microsoft be involved with facial recognition technology even to begin with? Why create it?
Well, I think that's a fair question. I think for all of these technologies, we should always ask that question. And if technology is not serving some societal good, if it's not advancing some societal benefit, then I think we ought to be asking whether it is something we're investing in. As a company that does create facial recognition technology, I see certain scenarios that I do believe are societally beneficial. Let's not forget that we've always had facial recognition. It's called, do you recognize the person in this photo? Now we look to machines to basically help us. The first thing we should recognize is looking to machines to help us isn't the same thing, or should not become the same thing, as asking machines to make that decision for us. But if, for example, you see a potential terrorist at an airport, or coming through an established border checkpoint where photos are shown already, or if in a very different setting, you're trying to identify a missing person, then I do see beneficial uses for this technology. At the same time, I readily agree that this is a technology that is subject to abuse and misuse. And that's why I think to some degree we have to be not just careful, but even perhaps cautious and not just rush forward. Hence the importance of self-regulation. It's why we as a company said that we would put a halt to the provision of facial recognition to police departments in the United States. And it's why we've been public in saying we've turned down customers who wanted to deploy this because we worried that it would put people's fundamental human rights at risk.
In the free market, though, presumably those police departments could go just pick up that a type of facial recognition technology elsewhere, and then at that point, would Microsoft have a role or a voice in how that technology is used, or at that point, if they use somebody else's, is it sort of, would you see it as out of your hands, or?
Well, I think that is such an interesting question. It's something that we debate internally and we talk about with our employees. The first point that I think one should conclude is one that you're basically suggesting. It's not enough to hope that, let's just call it a group of responsible companies will do the right thing. Because if a group of irresponsible companies does not, we still may see the market take us to the bottom. The only way to avoid that kind of race to the bottom is to put a regulatory floor in place. Hence, the adoption of laws, I think, is something that needs to be pursued, not just as a matter of priority, but with real urgency, because this technology is moving forward. And that's why I hope that even people who would just like to see this technology banned will at least devote some of their thought to the adoption of laws that will put safeguards in place. For example, the kind of safeguard that we have in Washington State, the only place in the world right now that can say it's against the law for the police to use facial recognition to surveil peaceful protesters. But there's another part of the question you're asking which always matters to me. Look, at the end of the day, we may say no, and others may say yes, and they may win the business, and we may lose it. But I always want the people who come to work at our company, many of whom are young, they could work at just about any tech company they want, to feel that decades from now, when they're older, when they have children or grandchildren, and they are asked, what did they do? That they can look others in the eye and say, you know what, we didn't make all the money that we might have, but we feel good we did the right thing. No one is perfect, but you're a lot better if you try.
Well, Aristotle would probably approve of that statement, no doubt.
I hope so.
You mentioned earlier in your speech the concept of a digital Geneva Convention. Remind me, what is that about exactly? And how effective would something like that be to address these problems that you're talking about?
Well, the first thing I hope that we'll do in the 21st century is remember one of the great moral advances of the 20th century, an advance that came out of the horrors of World War II. That was a war that saw 60 million people die, most of whom were civilians. So the nations of the world came together in 1949 with the International Committee for the Red Cross, and they adopted what's called the Fourth Geneva Convention. And the fundamental tenet in that convention is actually very simple. It says even in a time of war, a government has a legal responsibility to avoid causing casualties or harm to civilians. And so to me, the question is this: if it's unlawful for a government to harm a civilian in time of war, how can we turn away when we're seeing these kinds of cyber attacks on our civilian infrastructure in a time of peace? We should strengthen international law to protect against that. And in some cases, there are building blocks under the law that exist today. In some cases, we need to fill in gaps. And to answer the other part of your question, which I think is so important, will this be a panacea? Will this be perfect? Of course not. No law in the history of humanity has ever eliminated all forms of crime. if a passage of a law would do so, we would not live in a world where any country or community has a police force, or any nation even needs a military. So you might ask, then why bother? And I think the reason is this: we need to establish the kind of clarity about what is permissible and what is not. We need to draw these lines. We should not want to see this decade progress where any country can for a moment suggest that what it is doing to disrupt another country's electoral process is somehow permissible in a world governed by international law. So in my view, the sooner we act to say this is out of bounds and we're going to take steps to protect ourselves against this, the faster we'll have at least one of the many building blocks that we need.
And in many ways, what you just described could also be applied to the domestic situation in the United States right now. My colleague David Sanger was on earlier today, basically sort of obviously talking about in the wake of the debate and the sort of chaos that is being fomented ahead of the coming elections, and of course the use of these various platforms by a variety of groups to sow hatred and to incite people to action. I mean, how do you sort of see that playing out, and how, if at all, would some of the prescriptions that you're describing here this evening help to calm such a situation, or is that even possible at this point?
No, I think there are steps that are not only possible, but they're essential. I think fundamentally we should recognize that unfortunately we live in a world where when some entity figures out how to exploit something, other people learn from it. And so what we saw in 2016 as sort of a foreign attack on democracy is now being seized by domestic groups as well. And so we need to protect democracy from the outside as well as from erosion from within. I do believe that there is a broader conversation that one should have about the role of political advertising on social media. I applaud Facebook for saying it won't have political ads the week before an election. But we should ask ourselves this: if something is bad the week before the election, why is it good a month before the election? Why is it good at all? Or perhaps it is. Let's talk about it. But I do think that we should be asking ourselves fundamentally, are some of these things that we're seeing good or bad for democracy? If they're more bad than good, what are we prepared to do about it? And should we be pushing ourselves harder to address it?
Well, and that it brings back the question, though, who determines what is good and what is bad? We had a story out of the Philippines just last week where President Duterte was sort of threatening Facebook, suggesting that perhaps he might consider banning it from the country because the company had taken steps to take down fake posts, fake accounts that had been made sort of on his behalf. And his argument was that Facebook was essentially denying him his freedom of speech on that platform. Now, how do you sort of deal with a situation in which, dictators basically are using these platforms sort of to their advantage and throwing that argument back in people's faces? Well,
I think the first thing we should all do is recognize that if these problems were in fact easy to solve, we probably all would have solved them some time ago. It is this fundamental challenge that we have to grapple with. And just while on the one hand I might question the role of political advertising on Facebook or other platforms, I would in the next breath stand up to defend Facebook. I think the entire tech sector should. From the kinds of bullying that we can face from, say, authoritarian regimes around the world. I think ultimately there are two questions. One is, what does a platform or what does a tech company want to do? What are the standards it wants to adopt for its own business? And then second, what are the rules that will be embodied in law that governments want to adopt as well? And ultimately, for all of us as companies, we have decisions to make. The fact that our technology is global as we create it doesn't mean that it needs to be global as we deploy it. Every day we make decisions that we won't put a data center in a particular country, or we won't put a certain consumer service in a data center in a particular country because we conclude the risks to human rights are too high. So I think we, again, need to recognize, I wish we could say there's only one line that we need to draw. The reality is we live in a world that requires us to think about several.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as the title of the book that you and your colleague Carol Ann recently published is Tools and Weapons, the Promise and Peril of the Digital Age. Implicit in that title is basically the idea that technology is indeed a double-edged sword. And one of the anecdotes that you recount in the book is about how President Trump had a conversation with you in which he apparently implored you to use Microsoft technology to spy elsewhere in the world, and you said no to that. What happened?
Yeah, it wasn't actually the president himself, but it was somebody who was affiliated with one of his campaigns. And we've been very public since 2013 under President Obama in saying that we were not going to allow our technology to be used by one country to spy in this way on another. But it was an interesting conversation, and as we recount in our book,
bullying, so I think
as we recount, it was like, well, why won't you, use your technology to spy on these people in other countries? And my response was, is the Trump hotel chain prepared to spy on hotel guests in other countries? Is it prepared to spy on hotel guests that come to the United States from other countries? It doesn't actually strike me as a recipe that would be very good in the hotel business. It would not, in my view, be very good for the technology business either. Ultimately, I think what we recognize is every day we as consumers do depend on a level of trust. We trust that when we store our email in the cloud, that it's going to be protected, just like we trust that when we leave our clothes in a hotel room, they'll be there when we come back. So there are many aspects of this kind of question, but ultimately the real essence of it, in my view, is the importance of trust and the need to sustain it.
Yeah, trust is sort of the number one word and concept that has been bandied about this conference this year and in many of the previous years, because democracy is obviously based on citizens' trust in government, as well as citizens' trust in the other the framework of society, whether it be corporations, the family, et cetera. And trust really has been eroded significantly, partly because of the role that the platform, again, that social media has given to, as what Tom Friedman wrote in his most recent column, that the platforms have basically become these sort of cesspools for conspiracy theories and division and everything. And what you are, the ways that you are talking about trying to sort of address that are very difficult. I mean, those are very sort of tall hurdles that you're talking about. I mean, how confident are you that we're going to get this right?
Well, I think we first have to recognize that it is a very difficult challenge, and we're not doing nearly as well as we need to. It's actually a question that I spent basically 2 solid months this summer thinking hard about, together with Satya Nadella, our CEO, and a few others, because as everybody knows, there was this lengthy conversation about whether Microsoft might end up acquiring TikTok.
Yes, we didn't even talk about that.
And for us, one of the really important questions at the outset was whether we believed that we could operate this kind of social media platform in a principled and societally responsible manner. The first thing we recognized was this is difficult. The second thing we did was ask ourselves, well, what are the principles that we would apply if we were to find ourselves in this position? We articulated 5 around security, privacy, digital safety, especially safe for children, around authenticity, and then finally around transparency. And then we built out actually detailed engineering plans around each of the 5 principles. And it put us in a position to feel that we could go forward with confidence that we would have a prospect of really succeeding.
Yeah.
It did not for a moment leave us with the sense that it would be easy but it was a kind of challenge that we looked forward to pursuing, and I hope others will now pursue that with the same degree of energy.
Well, thank you for that. And let me wrap up, if I may, with just one last, since you are the person this year giving the Aristotle address, with a quick statement or that Aristotle might ask. And based on what you've been talking about here tonight, and also Microsoft's own legacy in the world, Aristotle would ask, is the world that you have helped create one that allows humanity to achieve its ultimate goal, the goal of happiness and well-being? You can give a Twitter response, yes or no.
The jury is out.
Yeah.
I do think at the end of the day, that is the right question. I would probably define it a little bit more broadly in this context to think about democracy as a whole. And I would simply say this: democracy was here long before any tech company that exists on the planet today. What I hope most fervently is that it will be here long after each of us is gone. No company lasts forever. Let's hope that democracy has a long life. Let's hope that we do what it takes as an industry to help promote that life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We greatly appreciate it, and you've given us a lot of hope, hopefully, and much to think about. So thank you once again.
Well, thank you.